If you've been on the internet for really any length of time, you've probably at least seen a picture that looks something like this. And if you've ever been even remotely interested in particular online spaces, you definitely know the story it's from, Jeff the Killer. For better or for worse, it's one of the most prolific creepypasta on the internet to this day. So what if I made it completely different? Before anything else, I want to say none of this is mean-spirited. Besides the fact that the story was written over a decade ago, I don't know how old the author was or if they're a non-native English speaker or something, and even if they were a 30-year-old scholar with a PhD in English, they definitely didn't anticipate the popularity that came their way. So, with that out of the way, here's a very brief summary of the original Jeff the Killer creepypasta, just in case you forgot.
Essentially, two young brothers, Jeff and Lou, move into a new neighborhood and are immediately bullied and threatened by a group of skateboarding, knife-wielding 10-year-old hooligans. Jeff essentially goes Super Saiyan and effortlessly beats up this entire group of kids, then Lou takes the blame and goes off to juvie. At another kid's birthday party, the hooligans make another appearance, this time with guns. Guns that they know how to use as children, even if their aim isn't great. Eventually, Jeff is chased into a bathroom, where he's accidentally covered in bleach, and one of these children throws a lighter at him, thus giving him his scary appearance.
There is, admittedly, a lot of insane stuff happening here, like the elementary school-age John Wick scene at the end. If I wrote the story, I would have never thought to include half of it. But that's what makes this so exciting. There is so much to pick and choose from to center my rewrites themes around, it makes me salivate a little. Like, yeah, it seems ridiculous that 12-year-olds who don't even have the killer appended to their names are so willing and able to murder someone. But what if that's the point? What if part of the theming comes from most children's inability to grasp the weight of human life? Or what if they're just a little older and have some connections that get them out of trouble so often they've started to abuse it in increasingly dramatic ways? Or what if they don't have those connections, but they're ignored by their community in a way that basically has the same effect? And how can this parallel Jeff's position in life? Why did he have to move into a new neighborhood that he hates? Did his dad lose his job? Is he having a rough upbringing? Why is he bullied immediately? There's so much potential here. I'm getting ahead of myself though. It's always most important to do the boring thing first and fix the grammatical and structural errors. Jeff the Killer is honestly a perfect example of why I do it this way, because it changes between past and present tense a lot, sometimes mid-sentence. So even before I've started writing, I need to make my first creative decision. What tense do I want the actual story to be in? Personally, I like writing in present, especially if I want a more suspenseful tone. It makes dangers feel closer to the reader in space and time, whereas things written in past tense have a tendency to feel further away or somewhat predetermined. But the original work is an origin story that ends on the harrowing idea that the main character might still be out there, Jeff the Killing People. It's framed as something of a campfire story, a myth that freaks you out as you're going to sleep because of the possibility that the big bad could get you too. So in an attempt to maintain this feeling, I did end up going with the past tense. Reading it again without the grammatical issues distracting me also allowed me to look at the events of the story as a whole to better understand the author's original intent and decide what could be changed to better match it. And I say it like that because while the original story clearly has a tone it's going for, the events don't necessarily support that tone. It opens on a newspaper headline explaining that the unknown killer is still out there, breaking into people's homes at night when they're most vulnerable, and it ends without him ever being caught. Jeff almost has a supernatural air about him. The problem though is that we learn Jeff is just a guy, not even an adult guy. He's a 13-year-old child. Even as a little kid, I remember thinking, does he have, like, a car? The first thing we read, the opening newspaper article, is a testimony from a kid who survived one of Jeff's the killings. And it makes it pretty obvious that if you have any way to beat a middle schooler holding a knife, you'll probably be fine. This brought me to an impasse almost immediately. Do I keep the characters and events as close to the original story as possible? Or do I sacrifice some material similarities to maintain its original spirit? Is Jeff the Killer still just some kid? Or is Jeff the Killer a spiritual being fueled by I know this sounds like I'm already taking things way too far away from the original story, but honestly think about it. Did you never think about Jeff as a supernatural being? When I was younger, I actually thought it was intentionally ambiguous because of how unintimidating a 4 or 5 child running around on foot is. A lot of people already kind of treat him this way too. You're telling me this little kid can take on Slender Man? Making him ghostly also fixes a lot of the crummy horror tropes that demonize real people. Mostly the cliches of mental illness making someone evil, or physical deformities and scarring being used as shorthand for scary guy, as if people whose faces look different don't just kind of exist in the real world. I didn't just go sicko mode with this either. It was surprisingly easy to connect the original version of Jeffrey with this new vision. Like, I didn't remember it until rereading, but there's interesting foreshadowing for Jeff becoming the killer throughout the original. He has a rage in him that builds up every time he's pushed into a bad situation, only really being released when he violently lashes out at others. And though it's never explained, this all only starts exactly when the story does. I know logically it's not supposed to be supernatural, but it feels supernatural. It feels like something that shouldn't exist is poking and prodding at him from the inside, trying to puppet him around, making him act how he shouldn't, replacing him with itself. Depicting a character having a mental break has certain literary traditions associated with it, and this doesn't follow those traditions. It isn't just an anger or adrenaline driving him forwards. He gets physically stronger. He takes on 3 kids his age, at least one of whom has a knife, and he wins easily. It's weird, it's warped, it's unfamiliar, and it's so rife with unsettling possibilities. When I actually wrote this in, I tried to maintain this weird vagueness. Even as it's being uncovered what kind of force is inside of Jeff, filling him with that feeling of burning rage, the rules aren't explicitly laid out. It's obviously connected to the house that his family moved into, and it eventually offers an explanation as to why the other kids are harassing him in the first place, but it's not clear why it chose him, or exactly what power it holds over him. Sometimes, it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. Once I decided the basic foundation of who or what I wanted Jeff the Killer to become, it was time for the fun part, filling in literally everything else around this foundation. Something I wrestled with a bit was the fact that everyone knows how the story ends. Even if I'm changing things around, even if I completely break down and rebuild who Jeffrey Woods is, things can only end one way, with Jeff becoming the killer. Anyone interested in reading my version of the story would probably already know the end point of its main protagonist. I only really had 2 options here. I could write some kind of twist happy ending where the red around Jeff's mouth is from a popsicle he's enjoying on the beach, or I could try using the fact that this is such a well-known character to my advantage. I wonder which one I chose. To do this, I put a lot more emphasis on Jeffrey's relationship with his family, and especially with his brother Lou. Their move to a new home weighs a lot more heavily on Jeff, and each of his family members emotionally support him through it in their own ways. You're meant to relate to him a lot more, recalling what it's like dealing with major life changes as a child who hasn't developed strong emotional intelligence. It's hard for him. He wants to go back. He subconsciously forces himself to grow up a little too quickly, and he starts engaging in potentially self-destructive behavior. But it's difficult for him to even tell this is what's happening. When he takes a long walk far away from his house without telling anyone, it's not like he understands it's because he craves control over his own life. It's just something he's decided to do. I know this doesn't immediately seem like it's playing into the fact that the ending is so well known, but think about it. Wouldn't this fill you with dread, connecting with a character, empathizing with him, finding yourself praying that he finds happiness, while knowing that you're reading the origin story of a guy who endured so much physical trauma, his last name was legally changed to Killer? I thought this would be the most difficult thing to contend with, but it actually motivated me a lot to hold the meat of the story to a higher standard. I basically had to develop the characters if I wanted it to succeed. I couldn't just stick the landing and hope that was good enough. That said, it was not nearly as easy as I thought it would be to actually rewrite the scenes that are in the original story. For one, even as much as I've been changing things, I really did want to include as many elements from the original creepypasta as possible. The whole fun of doing something like this is taking the things that seem a little outlandish or that have been criticized for years and spinning them into something new. The big gunfight at the climax, for example, while a bit ridiculous given its context, was exciting to play with and figure out how to include in a grounded way. To be frank though, there are some very funny things that happen in the story. Like, Lou tells cops he committed a crime and he is immediately taken to juvie without any trial. It kind of betrays the age of the author at the time, because this is exactly how I understood the legal system when I was very young. Jail was just a nebulous space that you got courted off to the second you were arrested, and juvie was a smaller version of it filled with 7-year-olds. Court was Judge Judy, I guess. The point is, I had to think a lot about exactly what I wanted to keep and why, and this was way more complicated than it should have been. A child being arrested for an attempted murder he didn't commit, for example, seems too massive of a plot point to ignore, but it hardly matters in the original story. It plays out in a few lines and only serves to remove Lou from the narrative. His parents don't even seem that bothered by it. There was absolutely no way for me to keep this in without changing everything. The legal process of a child being arrested for assault and attempted homicide is so massively complex, it would have become the entire focus of the story. I had to remove it because literally everything else would have taken a backseat to this meaningless exchange. Whoa, but you kept in the guns though. Yeah, I did. Unlike Lou's arrest, the gunfight is a pretty big deal. It's the climax of the story, the whole reason Jeff the killer looks the way he does, and the driving force behind his eventually turning into a murderer. The way it's depicted is a little unrealistic, with 12-year-olds just having access to and presumably training with firearms. But kids can get guns in real life, often upsettingly easily. You read about it on the news all the time. Either parents don't lock up their firearms well enough, or they actively encourage their children to use them, and it often ends in tragedy. So rather than take another step away from the events of the original, I used this reality to shape my version of the tale. Troy, one of the kids used mostly as a fat joke in the original, is an older teenager now. He's the only one with a gun, and it's very clear he has no idea how to use it. He's holding it mostly as an intimidation tactic. It's clearly freaking him out just as much as it's freaking everyone else out, and it's implied throughout the story that his living in familial situations aren't exactly the most secure. Most importantly, Troy pulling a gun at all is an act of desperation. The boys aren't just prepubescent gangsters anymore. They're at risk of experiencing pretty severe consequences for something they've done in the past, and Troy feels like he's running out of time to hide it. That brings us to the final part of this adventure, the part of writing that always takes the most effort for the smallest returns. Despite the story of Jeff the Killer now being as old as the character of Jeffrey Woods himself, a lot of people write CinemaSin-style criticisms of it to this day. There's the juvie thing, there's the fact that bleach alone does not whiten someone's skin, there's the dubious flammability of the liquids that caused flames to engulf Jeffrey's body, there's the fact that burn victims do not look like this, there's the bizarre lack of care for medical procedures and Jeff's bandages remaining unchanged for the length of his stay, and his being sent home in the outfit he was burnt in. There's blah blah blah. People are free to make this criticism, but I honestly think if anyone's still harping on this story tried to write something like it, they would be far more willing to give it some leniency. Regardless of how much sense it all makes, the fire engulfing Jeffrey is such an iconic scene, I felt like I had to adapt it. Even though I already wrote a reason for his face to look like this separate from the burns, they offered an excuse for his family to accept his new appearance. Denial is a very strong, persistent part of grief. If your child just miraculously came back from a near-death experience and you hadn't ever looked at a burn victim before, you could convince yourself that they could look like this. Do you know how hard it is to naturally write in a 13-year-old being engulfed by a highly flammable liquid at a block party? Initially, I just had an adult accidentally spill alcohol on him in the panic of a gun being pulled. I did some research though, and most beverages aren't actually that flammable. Even flaming drinks that can be put out with a light breath have a far higher alcohol content than what anyone would reasonably serve at a block party. Okay, maybe I could still figure out a way to incorporate the bleach though. I finally decided on the explanation that the husband in the family hosting the party was just getting into making flaming cocktails and really wanted to show off all his new equipment to any other guy who would talk to him, because I thought that was the only thing that made sense for a bored suburban middle-class dad. That at least offered an explanation for how Jeffrey ignited. I wasn't sure if it was realistic for the flames to cause as much damage as they did, but I fortunately had already written in an entire supernatural entity based around an intense burning feeling. I'd been using this mostly as symbolic foreshadowing, but it ended up making a lot more sense for the strange force to just actually cause the flames to be more intense. The scene immediately after this, though, is Jeff waking up in the hospital after being burned alive. It should go without saying, but treating a major burn victim is far more difficult than even most Hollywood productions would have you believe. I was reading PDFs of medical guidebooks for hours, and I still barely walked away with a passing understanding of the best time to discharge someone in Jeff's position. Especially with burn victims, everything is different for every patient, and new advances in medicine are being made all the time. Even figuring out when Jeff's bandages would be changed was an adventure. Sometimes it's hourly, sometimes daily. Often special types of dressings shouldn't be touched for longer periods of time during initial healing, and that's just one factor at play in the ICU. They try pretty hard to get you into a different rehabilitation facility as fast as possible. What does that process look like? How long do you stay hospitalized after transferring out of the ICU? Do they keep you under general anesthesia? Do the bandages stay on outside of the ICU? Do you get to go straight home if you've supernaturally recovered from all of your pain in a way that isn't scientifically possible? I don't know! The good thing is that because there's ghost stuff happening in the story, characters are not going to react completely rationally. I didn't have to accurately portray what the doctors are supposed to do in the event that a perfectly cognizant patient's body has seemingly died, because that situation cannot happen. The fact that even medical professionals don't really know what to make of Jeff's condition ended up naturally becoming part of the ending. Even the healing process itself, which I did actually research a fair bit, didn't end up being super important to the final product. I left it intentionally vague exactly how the supernatural elements are influencing Jeff's physical body, but his face is healed into the iconic pale image we all know and hate well before his bandages are ever even changed. I wrote this as if it's just a normal thing that doesn't need any explanation, the same as eating or breathing. My intention was to set an uncomfortable, unsafe mood as the reader is suddenly forced to accept these processes that are very unfamiliar to them, but now seemingly natural to the main protagonist. The point is, as it worked out, I didn't have to accurately portray at-home care or a standard discharge procedure. He's very eager to go home and tear the bandages off, he has no need for follow-up visits, and of course, he quickly leaves his old life behind, just like in the original story. Even giving myself all that leniency though, figuring out the timeline of a severe burn victim's initial treatment was the hardest part of writing this thing. I'm sure it's all still embarrassingly inaccurate, but I really wanted to at least try getting the important details right and giving these scenes the weight they deserve. If it's not obvious, I ended up really caring about this story in my version of Jeffrey Woods. The tight-knit connection of the main family and the perspective of the world through the eyes of someone at Jeffrey's age became incredibly important to me. For all of the original story's flaws, and as much as it's been ripped apart over the years, I think reimagining it really helped me understand the value people found in it in the first place. Bullying, a connection between two brothers, loss, being forced to mature too quickly, control, and autonomy. These themes were all present in the original version of Jeff the Killer, even if it couldn't find the right words to show it. How could it not make me wonder where the author was coming from? How could I not feel connected to them now? How could I not find depth in these misplaced words and sentence fragments? Of course, my version is still a little cheesy and might feel contrived in a few places, but I think sometimes that's just the price of putting your heart into things. I hope you enjoyed this.